Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Perspective. We'll be talking about the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' visit today, his pledge to help Pakistan, his remarks as far as the meeting of the Prime Minister is concerned, the Foreign Minister is concerned. Of course, the Prime Minister has said that the meeting with him has been very productive. He's also shown empathetic leadership to highlight sufferings of the flood victims. The international community should come forward to help Pakistan. We've also had the Foreign Minister Biodiversity talk about the plight of the people. He said that, of course, whereas his party stands for food, shelter and clothing, he cannot shelter 35 million families who have been affected by the floods at this time. As far as the donor conference is concerned, we are of course waiting for a joint assessment, a joint damage assessment, so that can be comprehensively completed, and then the fact that we can move on from the rescue and relief phase, which we are still at. We'll be talking about all of that. We'll also be talking about the ramifications of this very important visit for the flood affectees at this time, what it can mean for those affected by floods, for Pakistan at this time. Of course, the UN Secretary General has talked about the obligation on international community to do what they can to support Pakistan to meet the challenge posed by these devastating floods. We'll be talking about that. We'll also be talking about overall, as far as carbon emissions are concerned, Pakistan not being responsible for the kind of damage that we've seen, the kind of havoc that these floods have created, the kind of climate change globally and its impact on Pakistan. All of that today on Perspective. I have with me Munir Ahmed, who's a geopolitical analyst, also a climate advocacy expert. Thank you for joining us today. We also have with us Dr. Jameel Khan, who's a former ambassador. Thank you for being with us. Dr. Salma Malik, who's a foreign affairs expert. Thank you for joining us today. Ji, Munir Sahab, we've spoken, of course, as far as the effect of the floods are concerned. This visit, of course, is very important. One can't stress on, how important it is for us to have the UN Secretary General rally with Pakistan at this time. And of course, his visit is welcome on every front. Overall, what do you see as an effect of this very important visit?
Thank you very much. First of all, certainly the Secretary General's of United Nations visit to Pakistan is very significant, and it's a symbolic global support to Pakistan. And meanwhile, he has also urged developed countries to contribute $160 million to the flood relief efforts that we are taking up. And meanwhile, I have also I also know that UNDP and other UN organizations are also picking up for their early recovery assessments. And first of all, we don't have any assessment of the entire loss and damage that is done. We say it's a catastrophe, but we don't have actual assessments. And with the UN organizations, I believe in the coming days, we will be having a very comprehensive damage assessment. And besides, the early appeal to the world by the UN Secretary General is $160 million, and that is quite significant. And the Secretary General has also urged the world to reduce fossil fuel consumption and to take immediate steps to adapt and mitigate climate change
effect on Pakistan.
Yeah.
With that, I'm going to go to Dr. Jameel. Dr. Jameel, as far as the effects are concerned, as far as the overall effects of fossil fuel emissions, carbon emissions, overall the damage that we've seen wreak havoc on the floods at this time, the damage overall for Pakistan. How do you see this? Of course, we've had, we don't know, which is what Munir Sahab is saying, the joint damage assessment also. Bilawal Bhutto Zardari also said the same thing, that we don't know. I mean, we're in the process of trying to evaluate the kind of damage that, the potential damage that might happen, that is still in the process. But in terms of the donor conference, in terms of course, the money that's already been pledged, how do you see this development, particularly with regard to the visit at this time?
Two things here, because I have my personal experience of serving the United Nations for over 10 years. And I know that all the pledges which is made has never been materialized in past for any disaster, for that matter, or for any cause. So $160 million appeal, the flash appeal, which means this goes on for 3 months. And this is for basically the rescue and relief. And then for the reconstruction and rehabilitation, there is going to be a donors conference, and that's what the standard procedure of the United Nations is. That donors conference, and there this visit of the Secretary General is going to be very significant because of this visit. The very awareness among the international community definitely has enhanced manifold. So therefore, I think this visit, and then in a very strong way and in a very strongly worded words, he has described it that humanity, they have declared war against the nature, but nature has come back, and nature is now tracking back.
In terms of, let me come back to you. I'm going to go to Dr. Salma Malik. I will come back to you. Dr. Salma, in terms of the fact that, the damage that we are seeing, the assessment of that damage, of course, is awaited. We don't know the exact damage. We're in the process of evaluating. But in terms of this visit, its potential ramifications for the international community, for other potential donors, for the world to rally behind Pakistan in this kind of crisis. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much for having me on this panel. You see, the type of loss that we are looking at the moment is right in real terms. The major damage or the disaster is what will happen the day after, and how people, when they try to pick back on their lives, how it is going to affect it. We haven't really made an estimation of the livestock, the droughts that will follow, the damage to the crops, even to the national heritage. Mohenjo-daro stands suffered as a result of that. There's so much that has to be rebuilt. But to your question about how the international community is going to look at, number one, of course, are those who are the climate-friendly nations who have been trying to bring the global attention to the damages as well as the ill effects of climate change and the commitments that the world community has made to mitigate the worst effects of the climate change. Pakistan stands at number 18 out of so many countries, 100 plus, in terms of the highest risk to climate change. And much of what is happening in Pakistan is not its own doing. But that's how the inequality, as Ambassador Jamil was also pointing out about nature lashing back at those who have wreaked havoc on it. So that also means that what will happen tomorrow? People are already, in fact, the entire world is already trying to get back from a post-COVID economy, and every country is suffering in its own right. And for them to come together and pledge money for such ventures, where it is a very humane act, and they must do it because there's a global commitment towards these things, but it's not going to be a very easy job. Plus the fact that at the same time, there's another layer where people are fighting in Ukraine, and the South China Sea is a hot flashpoint, and there are small previous wars also continuing. For the global community to rally together and look at this would be a little difficult, but of course, because it is coming from the UN panel, there would be a level of commitment. People, world community will rally behind Pakistan, and they will help them. But a lot depends on what we then need to do, God forbid, because this is a pattern which is developing. In 2010, we had catastrophic floods, and many of the areas which are affected today were affected at that time. In 12 years' time, we haven't really fully understood how disastrous natural calamities can be. And we are once again caught in the same vicious cycle. So we can't keep on not mitigating these or preempting these disasters and relying on the fact that after this enormous loss to the country, the global community will come to salvage us. So we need to not only, if the amount that is being talked about is provided to Pakistan, we also need to take adequate measures and also fulfill our commitment to the SDGs in terms of climate change and mitigation, and see as to how we can prevent our country from becoming one of the single-digit countries out of, instead of 18 out of 191 countries which are affected by climate change.
Dr.
So,
Salma, I'll just
these
come back
things
to
we
you.
have
I'll
to
come
really
back
look
to you.
at.
I think that
Sure.
what the points that you've made are very relevant. I'll just come back to you. I'm going to go to Dr. Munir. Dr. Munir, one, I think the 2 points that Dr. Salma has raised are very important. One, she spoke about the fact that really the climate overall, the world at this time has its own battles and they're fighting on those, one being the post-COVID economies we are seeing at this time, overly burdened, inflation running rampant, all of those, even in the most developed of nations, those are a reality at this time. Secondly, of course, the fact that, we have to take responsibility for ourselves, and we have seen, climate change is a factor. But then, on the other hand, of course, how responsible we are and, how much contribution we've made to those fossil fuel emissions that, we've resulted, that have resulted in this kind of damage are also factors. How would you look at that?
Certainly, Salma Malik Sahaba has made a couple of good points. Responsible, certainly we are not a responsible nation. Though we say that our carbon emissions is less than 1%, and we try to take advantage of it. And we are not taking it more responsibility on us to reduce our fossil fuel consumptions, one thing. Secondly, our vehicles are not that, environment friendly. They emit a lot of carbon. Our industry and even every household, the appliances that we have at our homes, they are outdated.
But Munir,
and they all contribute to the atmosphere, one thing. As for floods are concerned, as I have several times mentioned that we stopped the waterways, the pass of the natural pass of the rivers, the natural streams, and that in fact contributed a lot to the damage. If we had not done it, the housings on the natural paths of the natural streams or on the banks of the rivers, at the edge of the rivers, certainly it would have not. Thirdly, we don't have storages where we could store our flood water. So we have to take these measures all together. Another thing, as earlier I mentioned, that it is very significant.
But Munir Sahab, one is, taking those measures to safeguard ourselves from future damage.
Yeah.
And these measures that you're talking about, are, of course, that's in the future. That's for us to take now, perhaps to safeguard ourselves from more damage in a few years, next year, when we, couple of months, all of those things. But at the same time, what damage we are seeing at this time, as far as the havoc, the devastation.
That is huge damage.
That itself, we need help from the world.
Certainly,
and that
yes.
is, of course, we say that we need to be responsible for whatever we are doing, things that we have done wrong. But the world also needs to take responsibility for
what
the fact
they have done
that,
wrong.
what they have done.
You're right. But unfortunately, the developed countries are not taking the responsibility what they have contributed to the climate change. They need to immediately act upon. And under Paris agreements, what commitments they have made, they need to fulfill their commitments. They need to contribute to Green Climate Fund. They are not contributing. Again, as I earlier mentioned, that Antonio Guterres has appealed to the world for $160 million. But we have seen in the past only 10-15% people contribute to that appeal. And
Dr.
On-
Jameel, I will come back to you. Jameel Sahab, I hope you've been listening to what Munir Sahab is saying. He's saying that as far as responsibility is concerned, it works both ways. We need to have the world take responsibility for the kind of climate damage that Pakistan is suffering. And of course, to realize that amount, 10-15% usually, is what one can expect, the kind of estimation that we've seen. Of course, we're also in the process of having an accurate estimation overall of the kind of damage that we have seen. What do you expect? Do you think the world will own up? Also with respect to the Paris Agreement, Green Climate Fund, those are important factors when we ask the world to rally behind us.
Well, there are mechanisms, international mechanisms to make the world realize. It so happens that the Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, is here in this country for 2 days visit. That by itself jacks up the awareness of the international community, and it is a reminder of the Paris Agreement. It's a reminder that the responsibilities, what else a Secretary General would say that the responsible countries who are the US is the number one country which is having the carbon emission. Number two is the European country. Pakistan, as it's being discussed, less than 1%. So we can take the responsibility of that less than 1%. It's true that we have to go in the right direction. There are certain organizations in our country, they are going and they are very close to the zero emission. Aga Khan University is one of them. And I've personally examined that the president of Aga Khan University has announced that it's going to be a zero carbon all over wherever they are working. So this model is also being borrowed by Sindh government. So at that small level, if it could be done, we should make an effort at the country level too. But you were talking about the assistance, what we can get, that kind of devastation. The scale of devastation is beyond anyone's imagination. We all know about 1 million cattle, the million livestock, they have lost. We have lost about 35 million people are affected. Health issue, water issue, the rescue issue has not been completed as yet. So the help, of course, is needed enormous. And this is what Antonio Guterres flash appeal, what they have made. But after that, there's going to be a donors conference, as I was describing to you a little while ago. The donor conference would then help us, possibly help us out in the rehabilitation phase, which is more important. If we don't do that, those people who have lost their homes can never go back. Now, coming on what we should do, we should have to enhance two things. One, that we have to have our economic diplomacy so that we have few more dollars in our pockets to spend and meet this. We have a problem of our external and internal debt of $267 billion. Added on that is this kind of a cost which we are going to bear. Last time, the impact of the 2010 flood was 43 billion. And this time, our briefing to the Secretary General today was 30 billion impact. Now, we have to first make ourselves a little more stronger in terms of our economy and our economic diplomacy. Number two is very important. Again, we have not yet started in foreign ministry, which probably they'll start very soon, is the climate diplomacy. If we don't do that climate diplomacy, we cannot raise this point, or we cannot have this point raised in the forthcoming General Assembly session, which is going to happen just few days from now. So we have to really...
What do you mean when you say climate diplomacy? Could you explain that?
Yeah, climate diplomacy would be all the agreements which have been done and passed, including Paris Agreement. And what all Antonio Guterres has mentioned today about the developed countries, about those countries who have maximum share in the carbon emission, they have to take the responsibility and have the share of their own. And that's how countries like Pakistan has to do its own advocacy, as well as the advocacy for those countries which are the least contributor of the carbon emission. But then in that case, that can only happen if you do it under the three layers of the diplomacy. One is the traditional diplomacy, which is through our missions. Second is the public diplomacy, which we should do, and we should do it always. Third one is the legal diplomacy. We should go and knock the door of the right forum, which is the United Nations, to make the world community realize, who have pledged and who have committed about the Paris Agreement and what all they are supposed to do. that those pledges have not been met. So that is what the climate diplomacy would
Right. Let
attempt
me
to
go
do.
to Dr. Salma. I'll come back to you. Dr. Salma, as far as, what Dr. Jameel is saying, I think is very important. He's talking about, diplomacy on various levels. He's saying that we need to, engage the world in these different ways. He's also talking about climate diplomacy. He's talking about, the normal diplomatic channels in trying to get the world to give us the kind of funds we will need to then, deal with the kind of damage that we are seeing, the kind of potential damage for years to come that we have seen to livelihoods, to cattle, to to lives that we are seeing. Do you see us, in the way that the world has reacted? Do you see? Are you optimistic? How do you look at things overall in your assessment of how the world has looked and taken Pakistan's, the flood here, our damage here, the effect of it to Pakistan?
Right. You see, one thing that we need to see when it comes to natural calamities or non-traditional security disasters, etc., is that these are issues such as the pandemic, which are undiscriminatory, right? They do not discriminate between who's what. The point that the Secretary General also pointed out, that the nature is striking back, and it is not striking back at the people who play with the nature, but it is undiscriminatory in its response, and it is even affecting those who, in any case, were vulnerable. So what we need to realize is that, God forbid, if the floods had happened in Pakistan today, tomorrow they can happen in any other parts of the world. However advanced, underdeveloped, developing those parts of the world may be. If the pandemic started from Wuhan, China, it affected the entire world. So I think this is high time that the global community, regardless of their economic stature or their military potential, they need to realize that natural calamities and disasters do not see how strong a country is when it comes to its military might. So we need to develop, as an international entity, a common connectedness when it comes to these disasters. There's a lot of calamity that
Dr.
is happening in
Salma,
Afghanistan.
we'll connect again. I'll come back to you. Munir Sahab, I think what Dr. Salma is saying is very important when she's talking about the fact that how isolated the world, if COVID didn't underline it, then I don't think anything can. The way that the world is connected now, the way that we can't view any any disease, any effect of natural disasters like the floods that we are seeing at this time, climate change, in isolation to one country. And then she also talks about the fact that how developed a country is doesn't necessarily reduce its vulnerability to these factors. So those factors need to be underlined when we talk about the UN. We talk about UN taking an interest. We talk about this visit, particularly of Antonio Guterres. All of those things are relevant, and for those factors to be underlined in the kind of diplomatic efforts that he's talking about, that Jameel Saab is talking about, on various forums in those various ways, and trying to bring the Paris Agreement. You yourself mentioned, we talk about the green climate funds and the seriousness of it. Today it's us, tomorrow it can be any country in the world.
Yeah.
And there's no denying overall the effect of climate change and its damage.
Certainly, you are right. Recently, we have seen a severe heat wave in Europe and Australia that has damaged their economy, their people, and perhaps this is the first time the Europe realized that even they can be the victim of climate change. And this could be maybe a realization to contribute to green climate fund, and maybe they will be more interested to take mechanisms to reduce carbon fossil fuel emissions and other emissions they are contributing to the atmosphere. And as Jameel Saab said, definitely we have to go for our climate diplomacy. I have been asking for such kind of initiatives very long. When I kicked off climate change in 2000, mainstreaming of climate change in 2007, since then that we need to project our vulnerability to climate change.
Right.
Unfortunately, we are not projecting our vulnerability to climate change. We need to. And certainly we need to also highlight the kind of poverty that we have. And the 50% of our population is more vulnerable to the impact. But we are not taking this situation to the world.
Jameel sir?
And thirdly, we are not reducing our own destruction in our country. On the other hand, the corporates, they have billions in CSR, corporate social responsibility funds.
Right.
Oil and gas companies have billions of funds at the moment lined with them. They are not spending lavishly as their responsibility is. I think as a second step, we can also engage.
The government can make an effort to engage these companies to
these
contribute.
Companies, their piled up CSR funds can be used for the flood relief and early recovery and reconstruction and rehabilitation process as well.
Right.
There is donor fatigue. We need to understand. No donor will be coming to invest in all the flood disaster you have met. You have to stand on your feet.
We have to extend ourselves. We have to make that
We have
effort
to take the major responsibility of the impact.
Right. Let me come back to you. Jameel sir, one or two things that Munisa is talking about are particularly important. One, that we have to take responsibility ourselves. The point is, as far as potential is concerned, we are already a country, before the floods came, we were already grappling with an economic crisis of huge proportions. And that's not a secret from the world. The way that we have gone to IMF, the way that, where our hands are tied, restrictive funds that we have, all of those things are a reality. We are a poverty-riddled nation. There's no denying that. Developing nation. However we may phrase it, do you agree with Munisa that we haven't underlined our plight emphatically enough? Or do you think it's just, of course, it's there for everyone to see the kind of effect that we have had, the kind of situation that we've been before, the way that we can extend ourselves, of course, we can do whatever is possible. And we are grappling with a crisis of unfettered proportions.
Absolutely. Every nation has its own plan and has its own policy. And we also have a disaster management plan. We also have a provincial disaster management plan. We also have a district disaster management plan. We have to stand on our own 2 feet. We should have learned some lesson from the 2010 or prior to that. And we should have taken some mitigating measures beforehand. First of all, whatever the overall governance we have, that of course has to be improved. But more importantly, we have to improve the disaster governance, the climate change governance. And in that, what I mean is that most of the water which has overflowed from the river Indus, it was basically we were blocking the nature there. We had made constructions within the river bed and side of the river bed, and we had cultivated lands by making our own private dams there. Obviously, that had obstructed the natural flow of the water, and because of which we had more. So all these things had to be taken care of before the forecasted the devastation of the flood. We could not do that. Now, the lesson learned from this flood, which is much higher on a scale even from 2010, as I was describing, that in 2010 it was only 400,000 cusic. This time it has gone up to 700,000 cusic. And still there is a high level of flood at Jamshoro. We have seen the devastation in so many areas of Balochistan and of the southern Punjab. So what I'm saying here is that yes, we have to stand on our 2 feet. We have to first implement whatever regulations and whatever law we have, in this regard, and of course, overall and in general terms. And at the same time, we actually aggressively enhance our outreach to the world community, because the world community, it's true that there's a donor fatigue, Ukraine war going on, there are other conflicts in other places going on, there are disasters going on, but this disaster is of scale which Antonio Guterres has
What
today
about this
mentioned.
particular visit? What about this particular visit of the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General? How will this, of course, it will highlight to the world the plight of Pakistan, but do you think it will have tangible results?
It has already started giving you the tangible results. UN, whatever funds, all the UN agencies, 26 agencies, they have here in this country and the region. What they have done is they have mobilized their funds. They have a limited funds, but they have diverted their budget under the authority of the Secretary General, and they have started sending the relief goods from Dubai warehouses, and there are more than 20-25 flights have already landed here. So this visit of Antonio Guterres would do a lot of advantages going to give us. Number one, that the UN own budget and own resources have been mobilized already. Number two, you have already heard and we have discussed about 160 million flash fund. Number three, we have already discussed about the subsequent donor conference, which OCHA is going to call. And then number four, we through our own climate diplomacy, this General Assembly, which is going to happen just few days from from now, we should do all our efforts to bring that awareness of this catastrophic disaster in Pakistan, and that's how we can mobilize some funds from the international community, which has been sufficiently highlighted and underlined by the Secretary General.
Right. Let me go to Dr. Salma. Dr. Salma, you highlighted particularly how it's not possible to view in isolation any calamity that happens to any one nation. And if COVID didn't underline that, then I don't think any other, it very, very aptly told us that it's not possible for the world to isolate itself. Climate damage, potential climate damage, from carbon emissions, fossil fuel, all of those things are a reality. These Paris agreements, if we talk about, Green Climate Fund, all of those things are also a reality that were made keeping in mind the kind of situation that we are seeing in Pakistan. However, there is a reluctance to act from the world. Would you agree?
I would say the same that the two previous speakers have said. There is a fatigue in general, and of course this is a very difficult time for the entire world community when the post-COVID economies, second overcommitment of various countries in traditional conflicts such as Afghanistan, and all of those things that are happening around us, so that is difficult. And of course that direct, indirect involvement of different big countries in issues such as Afghanistan, 20 years war, was not so monumental, but just look at the way these economies have been affected. So all of that thing is interconnected. But having said that, you see the fact is that the silver lining that we are trying to find, and what you're trying to bring us to technically say is how significant this particular visit is. It's very significant. It is also a fact that not only the United Nations, but the entire committee of nations that are part or member of the United Nations, that make the United Nations what it is, stand behind the Secretary General and his visit for 2 days, coming here and realizing what has happened. And as I said earlier, that the damage that we look at in real terms right now is far less than the damage. That's just the tip of the iceberg. What is going to follow in the coming days is far worse, direct as well as indirect consequence of the floods on the economy, on the life systems of these people, on how the earth responds to so much of water flooding. There's going to be a lot of disease. Already people are dying of dengue, malaria, so many other waterborne diseases, and it's going to get worse with time. And at the moment, I don't even think that there's an 100% correct assessment of how much damage has been sustained, because some of the areas are so far-flung. But when it comes to the world community, this common understanding that natural calamities will now happen a lot more than that were happening before, because humans are really destroying planet Earth. So the susceptibility of all the countries, including the global environmental south, is also going to become far more enhanced. So not only, I think the response has to be on different levels. It has to be an individual responsibility. It has to be a provincial responsibility. It has to be a countrywide. It has to be a regional responsibility. And here we are sitting and talking about several things. And where is SARC? I mean, SARC is already on a ventilator. I am talking about the ideal notion. But the very fact is that institutions such as SARC were made to mitigate non-traditional conflicts and have a combined regional response to that. So if Prime Minister Narendra Modi in his entire egoistic self thinks that flood in Pakistan today is not going to happen in India, he is absolutely incorrect. You see, Maldives is already a country of SARC that is severely affected by climate change. 10 years prior to this, the Maldivian Prime Minister actually held an underwater parliamentary session which was telecasted worldwide to make people aware of what will happen to Maldives in few years to come. So there's so many. Bangladesh already is underwater. So what are we thinking of? You see, today 1/3 of Pakistan is submerged, which is so unprecedented. A country with such diverse topography. But just look a little bit east, and you will find that Bangladesh is a country which is so severely affected by climate change already. Bangladesh has been making this appeal of rising river water potential already. But any one of us who is in this fallacy that the climate change is not going to affect them are fools of the biggest order. And then, of course, going beyond the region, then we have to look at all the countries around us. And that is why we need to have a very concentrated response towards climate change. And I think Pakistan should now become one of those climate change ambassadors to bring awareness to the world platform that this is something which is going to happen more often than ever before, and we need to look at it. You see, an earthquake that may originate from one remote fault line in Afghanistan can be of such a magnitude that it can go all the way to Dhaka, right? Because we have a common ground. We cannot divorce that. We may create artificial boundaries, we may create borders, but that does not restrict the earth from responding anywhere and everywhere. So there are certain disasters, there are certain threats which require a common interconnected approach, and that we really have to rise up to. And I think the international community will respond. However, they may be able to respond. They may not be able to respond as open-heartedly as they may, but the restriction primarily would not be so much of their not wanting to respond, but because of the restriction they have on their economies. They're already tight-fisted. So that factor is there, but Pakistan needs to, I'm sorry, I'll just say one sentence and revert to you. Pakistan needs to now use this occasion to actually, the point that Ambassador Saab was pointing out, becoming ambassador of climate diplomacy and raise awareness about it.
Right. Munir Saab, I think what Salma has raised very important points. She talks about Pakistan becoming a climate change ambassador. Of course, the kind of rampant effect of flood climate damage that we've seen, the kind of threat that we still remain under, and the fact that, of course, diseases, the health hazard that we are facing, that is certainly one of those factors that can propel us to work towards that. Do you think it will do so is another question. We're also having at this time, of course, the Prime Minister saying, and Bilawal Bhutto Zardari also saying that we need to rally behind this one cause at this time. The provincial governments, the centre, the federal government, the armed forces together trying to combat whatever damage can be, trying to deal with the effects of it, because we are still in that rescue phase. and we won't know exactly how much damage there is, and to livelihood, to food, all of those things. Do you think it will come to that? And the point about SARC, what are your thoughts on that?
First of all, as Salma Sahaba said, for regional approach. As she said, SARC is on ventilator, and we could not have SARC conference for many years now.
Right.
And just forget SARC as a regional player would be playing their responsibilities or any such things. And secondly, as we need to mobilize the global funds, our embassies are still silent. They are not very active as we are active within Pakistan.
Right. We need that
there are
kind of
different segregated efforts. Everyone is collecting funds. I don't know what would happen to them. The opposition party was also collecting. I cannot say opposition party because they have two provincial governments, Punjab and they raised about 5 billion in a telethon. I don't know what about that fund. On the other hand, army is doing its own efforts.
You're
and
saying
raising
that
funds.
we need a combustive,
we need to integrate them.
Together, yes, integrated effort. I think
them.
that's the right
There
word.
shall be some integrated plan, and unfortunately, we don't have at that at now.
To be able to take it up at the UN.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we will be having a global biodiversity conference. Pakistan is not represented over there. That such kind of forums are very valuable to show off, to highlight your vulnerability. That is very unfortunate. Even if some bureaucrats go over there, they just shop around. And they don't really take those forums seriously to highlight vulnerability. On the other hand, even we don't have a vulnerability hotspot identified in Pakistan. That is really unfortunate that we are suffering from floods and other heat waves and cold waves and so on for the last 15 years. But we don't have any hotspots identified, and that could be highlighted in at the global forums, or until you cry for your vulnerability at the global forums, you will not be able to mainstream your vulnerability, and the people will not. I have been watching the international channels. That is really, really unfortunate that only I could see two reports on Pakistan floods when it was at the high. One, a very small piece at Al Jazeera, and one at CGTN, China Global Television Network. Otherwise, I couldn't see. Bangladesh flood, every time when I watch these channels, the reports are there. It means Bangladesh is well connected to the global community and to the global media. And they are highlighting their vulnerability. Same is the case of the least developed African countries. They are much connected, much more than us, connected to the global community and to the global media. Their stories are being picked up the global media. What is wrong with us?
With us, so we need to engage, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for being with us. Munir Ahmed Saab, thank you for joining us. Dr. Jameel Khan, thank you for your very valuable input. Dr. Salma Malik, thank you so much for joining us today. As far as, of course, one or two things are very important that we discussed today. One, that Pakistan needs to engage the whole world. We need to, as far as our own champion, our own cause at this time, we need to tell the world our story of flood damage. We need to tell the world our story of climate damage, the potential of it, what's already happened, and the fact that years of damage will result from what's happening at this time. All of those things need to be highlighted on every forum. Of course, we've seen the Prime Minister, the visit of the UN Secretary General highlighting that. We've also seen across the board, the Foreign Minister Biodiversity also talk about the fact that this is our main focus as far as the government is concerned, as far as the armed forces are concerned, as far as overall a combined effort is needed to try to champion our cause, to try to highlight the pain and plight of our people at this time who are suffering from the floods on every front, on every diplomatic level, and to tell the world that it is not possible for the world to isolate itself from the kind of climate damage that Pakistan is seeing today, that any other country, developing, or any country is vulnerable to and can be vulnerable to. Let's hope that we can all join hands and work towards that and highlight that. Thank you so much for joining us today on Perspective.